Thank you so much, Drew. And thank you to everyone for joining us for this conversation on harnessing the power of interfaith advocacy to end hunger in America. My name is Sammi Goldsmith. I'm the Deputy Director of Public Policy at MAZON, a Jewish response to hunger. We are a national faith-based anti-hunger organization. And in my capacity here, I have the privilege and the pleasure of working with the three awesome advocates that you see here who either represent faith communities and their advocacy interests, or they serve those communities on the ground. So I want to give these folks the opportunity to introduce themselves. So I'll have you all share just a minute about you, your organization, and your mission. And I will go ahead and start with Aseel.
Thank you so much, Sammi. So my name is Aseel Elborno. I'm an advocacy manager with Islamic Relief USA, which is a relief development and advocacy organization. We work in 40 countries abroad and all over the United States, providing relief and development. And in my role, I help to recruit, train, and empower our supporters and our advocates around food security advocacy campaigns.
Excellent. Charles?
Thanks so much, Sammi. Thank you for being here with us on this important day to talk about a critical matter, and that's hunger in the interfaith advocacy community. I'm Charles Williams. I'm the Senior Domestic Policy Analyst for Bread for the World. And Bread for the World is a Christian advocacy organization that urges U.S. leaders to do everything in their power to create a world without hunger. So we essentially equip people of faith to advocate for the policies and programs that can end hunger in our country and around the world. I look forward to discussing how we can advance that mission together today. And in a second, I'm going to drop Bread for the World's impact report in the chat so you can take a deeper dive into what we're doing here in DC, across the country, and abroad. So thank you again.
Awesome. Thanks, Charles. And finally, DJ.
Hi, everybody. My name is DJ. I'm the Director of Policy at the Met Council. Met Council is a New York City-based social service organization that offers a wide variety of services to New Yorkers with a specific focus on serving New Yorkers with Jewish or Muslim backgrounds. And within our social services, our largest program is our food banking program, which operates an emergency food service program serving about 200 pantries monthly, exclusively with kosher or halal food. And I do our policy work and our research and advocacy on behalf of our food program and our other social services programs. I joined this work about 5 years ago, coming from a little bit more of like a community organizing background and wanting to get a little bit more into the traditional policy world. And since then, we've done a lot of good work to develop new data and new research as it relates to sort of faith communities experiencing hunger, both in New York City, New York State, and the country as a whole. So happy to talk to you all today. It's a really, really important time to be having this conversation, and let's get going.
Let's do it. If you have joined us in the last few minutes, you can probably assume based on the subject matter here that we have all arrived at this chat today because our organizations agree that ending hunger is not only a matter of economic and social stability, but a matter of human dignity and of justice. By drawing on religious and moral values, we believe that faith-based advocates have a very unique opportunity to engage with policymakers and communities to advance anti-hunger and broader anti-poverty agendas. And that's what we're here to discuss today. So I am going to pose some questions to our panelists, and we will try to save a little time at the end for audience questions. But let's dive right in, because in the last year, we have seen federal programs that help tens of millions of Americans meet their basic needs defunded, cut, and otherwise weakened, whether by rhetoric, by actual legislative action, or by executive action. And the programs that I'm referencing help folks access things like healthcare, housing assistance, childcare, and of course, food assistance, which we're here to discuss today, and which has certainly been making headlines lately. So I want to start with you, Aseel. How have faith-based organizations reacted to meet the needs of those affected by things like the SNAP disruptions that we've seen recently during this challenging time?
Thank you for posing that question, Sammi. And Islamic Relief USA works with partners across the United States that work on the ground with our beneficiaries in the communities that we serve. And I recently had a conversation with one of our partners named Barakah Muslim Charity in Rochester, New York. And she was conveying to me how she works in a predominantly African-American community that is in a food desert. There are no grocery stores around. It's really hard to access food. And most of their beneficiaries are not Muslim. They're from all walks of life. And she told me that with SNAP benefits and the government shutdown, she saw an increase in the need. And I was asking her, like, how do you rise up? How do you meet this need when there are so many challenges? And she pointed out to me that it's not just the food insecurity, because it's just like one link in a big chain of events that happens when these government programs cease to exist, or they decrease. And what she has been astounded to see is that our community, the Muslim American community, has really stepped up in terms of their direct giving and increasing and their direct charity to Muslim Barakah Charity in Rochester, New York. So like not even just as a grant from Islamic Relief USA, but the communities on the ground that see what's happening to this community really rising up and saying, okay, where the government hasn't been able to provide, we are stepping in. And, Islamic Relief takes no USG funds whatsoever. We are completely privately funded by our donors. And we know that every time that there's been an emergency, whether it has been from a natural disaster like the fires in LA, like the shortage in Flint, Michigan, our communities stand up and say, we are part and parcel of the overall community here in our state, here in our county, here in our community, and really raise up their giving directly to these partners that work on the ground. So that's what we've seen.
That's beautiful, doing that work across lines of difference and showing up for people of all faiths and backgrounds from a faith-based perspective. Charles, I want to move to you. What lessons from this action, from actions like these, from actions that Bread for the World is taking, how can those be applied for long-term policy solutions?
Sure. So at Bread for the World, we're working along our partners, both secular and non-secular partners, but specifically in the faith-based community. Our faith-based partners often feel the impact first of a disaster, to Aseel's point. And we tend to respond quickly, right? Like I always say that we are the first responders when disasters strike. We are the first responders when we have issues in the community, from hunger to housing. So, for example, when the government shut down and we saw these disruptions in food access, churches across the country saw pantry line demand surge almost overnight, right? And our partners, our coalition partners, our churches, our advocates, they had to step in there. Speaking to a worker in a food pantry, one of them said that they have been working in a food pantry for 11 years and had never seen anything like it, not even during the pandemic. So that's some of the things that we're facing as a community, the faith-based community, stepping in when disaster strikes. Number two, food pantries, food banks can't do it alone. During this year, we saw food banks and pantries open earlier. Some stayed open later. Some shifted volunteers from other locations and even some ministries just to keep up. In several cities, pastors shared with Bread for the World that families showed up to churches saying that their SNAP benefits had either been reduced or hadn't arrived at all. And so the church became the only option when these benefits are no longer there. And finally, we saw something else this year. Faith communities, we don't just feed people. The faith-based community, we speak up, right? We stand in the gap for people. Many of our faith-based organization partners are on this call, and they can speak to this. But when disaster strikes, national faith coalitions, they issue public statements, they show up on the Hill, they hold vigils. But specifically, we rightfully frame hunger as a moral crisis because that's what it is, not just a partisan issue. And so our job is to continue to remind lawmakers, like we've been doing this year, that churches can't do it alone, right? Churches and food pantries can't absorb the fallout of weakened federal programs.
Thanks so much, Charles. And that actually is a beautiful segue into asking DJ about, kind of in your experience, to Charles's point, I mean, why do we need long-term policy solutions that don't depend on religious or secular, for that matter, charity-based assistance?
Thanks, Sammi. And thanks, Charles. And sort of to answer your question, I want to reflect a little bit on the moment that we're in right now. Many of us here are concerned with ending hunger in this country, and we just went through one of the worst SNAP crises I think we've ever seen in the history of the program. Now, SNAP is a government program that's generally pretty reliable and gets people who qualify for all these different characteristics the benefits they need to purchase groceries. However, we operate an emergency food organization here in New York City, and so one thing that we see is roughly 60% of our clients, about 2/3 of our clients, come to us because they make too much money for SNAP, but not enough money to get by. These are people with young families, maybe mixed generational households, larger households, newer immigrant communities, things like that. And so I think we need long-term, and religious organizations, to Charles's point, churches and mosques and synagogues have always been the first stop for a lot of people experiencing hunger. They've been the places where you can set up a food pantry or where folks come to ask their clergy for help or support. But they ask for that help and support in part because government programs aren't meeting the needs of our communities. And the way that they're designed and the functions of income limits and certain work requirements make it so that folks fall off the rolls. And what we're going to see in the next couple months is an increase in folks falling off the rolls and coming to organizations like us for support, when in fact I personally think that the programs should be better designed to meet the needs of the communities that we serve. SNAP is the gold standard. It allows any recipient to take money in their hand and go purchase what they want. At the farm, I live across the street from a farmer's market, and it allows folks to double up their dollars to purchase at the farmer's market here. A food pantry and a food bank, which I love, and I love that we operate, we only provide sort of what we have on our shelves. It takes away choice, it takes away dignity, it creates lines, and then we're also just overly reliant on federal funding. And all of those things come together to make it a real challenge for us to pick up the slack, where I think the government should be stepping in and doing a better job with its programming and with meeting the needs of sort of our communities as they grow, as dollar amounts change, as inflation change, as grocery prices change, to make the programs change and fit those needs as well.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. We cannot do this work alone, but we do have our own superpowers here. So Charles, how do you see the reach and influence that faith and other values-based organizations have in their communities as different from, other secular groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, trust matters, right? Like a key lesson this year, and we're going to talk about the lesson learned, but a key lesson we learned was that local trust matters. Nearly half of U.S. congregations either run or support food programs, right? And so they see the human side of policy failures long before Washington does. I think it's important, whether you're secular or non-secular, to be able to take some of what we've seen this year and apply it in strategy moving forward, right? Using what I call like your shared values matrix, right? To ensure that it doesn't matter whether it's a private organization or it's a huge corporation or a small pantry, there are a subset of lessons that you can take into the community to make sure that folks are fed. So for me, there are a lot of differences as to how both secular and non-secular organizations approach the hunger issue. But I think there are more intersections than not, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I want Aseel to be able to jump in on this too. I mean, when we unite as a faith-based, coalition and community, how does that impact our ability to aid the most vulnerable?
I think Charles really hit it on the head about creating that trust within communities. What we see, because many of our partners are actually mosques that are in the country, and what we see is that because they are part and parcel of the neighborhoods that they are in, they really are in tune of the needs of the communities that they serve. So that means they have cultural awareness, they have cultural sensitivities, they know what their communities need because they interact with them on a regular basis. One of the partners that we work with in the Northern Virginia area had a refugee resettlement program. And so they not only saw where these refugees were being housed, so they were in the neighborhood, right? And they could walk over to the mosque, and then all kinds of services were provided based on the needs of that community because they had a relationship. And I think this is why we are sort of at an advantage when you have a faith-based organization that's doing this kind of work, because they're part and parcel of the community. They are not separate. They are not two different entities, and it's, feeding one another and being part and parcel together and in solving and eradicating some of these major issues.
Lovely. And DJ, just to get the final word in on this piece here, can you discuss a bit how the interfaith advocacy community can harness our collective values, specifically when it comes to advocating with policymakers?
Absolutely. I do just want to touch a little bit on the prior question and the answers that both Charles and Aseel gave too as well. During my time working at Met Council, I went on a brief stint and I worked at USDA at what used to be called the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. It's now called the USD Office of Faith. And at my time there, we worked across a wide variety of faith communities. I in my work now, I focus mostly on work with Jewish and Muslim communities, though we serve anybody and everybody who comes to our door, and we work with a lot of Christian churches as well. But one thing I learned in sort of a national position looking at this issue across the country is how important faith leaders are to their communities, specifically how much the communities come to faith leaders for support and how much that support and trust can really influence a community. And one thing we did while we were there is we tried to teach faith leaders about benefits programs and accessing other supports outside of just food pantries, because they were the ones who could answer questions for folks in their community. They wouldn't necessarily come to a benefits office or to a nonprofit that wasn't necessarily associated with whatever house of worship they were participating in, but they would look to their clergy. And if their clergy had better information and could support them in accessing certain programs, it was going to be more beneficial to the community as a whole. That aside, just to answer the question you did ask me, I think that, it's different in different places and different settings. Here in New York, there's very, very discrete and distinct communities that have a lot of electoral power and sway. And working within those faith communities and working across those lines is really important to how programs shift and change in our city. We're an incredibly diverse city. And with that, we can really use that voice to make positive impacts for our neighbors, whether or not it's necessarily often I had an old boss who used to say, maybe what is kosher to me might not be kosher to you. And different communities have different, very specific needs. But if we're all raising our voices together and taking those voices to policymakers, it can sort of, lift all of our boats.
Well, thank you so much for getting us started here, because I want to talk about some best practices around cultivating relationships between faith leaders and community members for change. So Aseel, I want to start with you. How can faith leaders encourage their communities to translate their faith into action, specifically to end hunger?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because like DJ just mentioned, faith leaders have a lot of power in terms of influencing their congregations, and also because there's so much trust, and they kind of are seen as the subject matter experts in everything, right, in daily living. And for those who are Muslim, we definitely, are looking towards our sheikhs and our imams and our religious scholars for guidance on how we are living our life day in and day out. So when you have those people in those positions saying, look at our text in the Quran, it says you cannot go to bed full if your neighbor is hungry, and that your neighbors have rights on you up to the seventh house down the street, that you need to make sure that they are getting fed, right? So those are it's very powerful lessons to say, if you are trying to live out your faith, then you are living out your faith based on the teachings of the Quran and the word of God. And God tells you can't be full while your neighbor is hungry, and that they have rights on you. And that obviously moves people into action. And then when also you're getting your messaging from your faith-based leaders, that part of your zakat, part of your sadaqah, like all the things that you are supposed to be living out, it's for making sure that you are helping the most vulnerable, the most in need. And just making sure that people are educated in their faith, and we get that education from our faith leaders that are in these communities that we all live with and on.
Yeah, absolutely. And DJ, back to you quickly, because I want to talk about kind of the inverse, where, like, how have you seen community members cultivate relationships with their faith leaders and kind of manage up a bit to engage them in their advocacy work?
So I think I hate to sort of keep coming back to this, but there's a real emphasis on like trust here, and I think that when you're engaged, like, I work in this space. I don't follow a kosher diet. I don't follow a halal diet, but I believe that everybody has a right to eat, and a right to access to food. And so within that, I often, will humble myself to learn from other people. Will do the background reading and research I need to do before approaching a given community. Will rely on my coworkers who know more than me. Or rely on community members who are members of a given community and who know the needs of their community better than I do. I talked about collecting like new data in some of the work that we've done in the past, and a lot of that was so that we can we're a direct service organization, and so we can use the experience of our clients and of our frontline providers to then try to make policy change and engage faith leaders and other leaders and stakeholders in this space. And so for us, it's really about sort of bringing people together, having conversations, getting their input directly into our work, and then being able to, my job is to sort of translate that input into access to a faith leader or to a stakeholder or to an elected official. And I think I really try to think about it as like, can I make their lives easier by the work that I'm doing so that they're more able to support the communities that we serve, is sort of the broad stroke of how I try to think about it. I think that's in the policy and advocacy space. So many people are being asked so much for help because there's frankly so many issues that folks who are struggling with poverty face in this country. And so anything I can do to hand somebody like a ready-made argument with the data and the information and some testimony from some folks who would impact, like, I just want to make it so that they can make the case as easily as they can, I guess.
Yeah, no, that sounds right. And I know that's something that all three of you do in your work. I know it's something that I strive to do in my own. And there are a lot of forces at play as we consider how to best communicate those needs to our faith leaders and to our congregations. Charles, how do you all address congregations and their hesitancy of getting involved because they think issues like hunger have become partisan?
Oh wow, that's a great question. I want to start at maybe a higher level
Sure.
and just talk about how deeply The faith communities are woven into people's lives. Like many families that are part of churches and congregations, they've been a part of those churches for decades. And so just going back to DJ's point, that trust and that moral credibility there, it runs deep. When a pastor talks about hunger, it doesn't feel like politics. It's deeply personal and spiritual. And so faith groups like Bread for the World, often know like who's losing their jobs or who's skipping meals, and churches know which families are struggling. That insight shapes advocacy in ways that policy memos cannot. And so I think it really depends on the goals of the church, the issues within a congregation, some regional influences there. It's that values language again. I've seen small congregations, we do offerings of letters where churches and advocates, they write to Congress. But I've seen small congregations write hundreds and hundreds of letters to Congress in one day because the call came from their faith and not from a policy memo. So, these faith settings allow service and worship and advocacy to blend together. I think some of the best congregations, some of the great leaders have learned how to separate policy, people, separate the policy from the people, and then bring all of that stuff into the pulpit where it's appropriate. So the policy, the people, in the pulpit. So those triple P's, folks who know how to wield those three are always good at it. So it's tough to really to land the plane and answer your question. I think more than ever, more institutions have been more political than we've seen historically. And so whether you are deeply involved in politics or not, the politics are going to find you, even the church.
Yeah, I want to open that one up to other folks too. Have you seen any hesitancy, within your communities to engage in advocacy on this issue in particular? Just want to make sure folks have an opportunity to comment before we move on.
I mean, I will just say that for the Muslim community, we're a little bit unique in that we are a community that is issue-based. We really, our politics is based on what is happening on the ground. So one year we may all be voting Republican, and the next year we may all be voting Democrat, and it's really based on the issues on the ground. So when it comes to hunger, because it's such a part and parcel of our faith that you're helping the most vulnerable and things like that, we're looking to, we're not seeing it from a political standpoint. We're seeing it from a faith-based standpoint, and we don't care like who it is that's running for office. If they're anti, social services or anti helping the weakest, the most vulnerable, we're not going to be, following that person. So I think that's what kind of makes the Muslim American community pretty unique.
And just to hop in and add a little to that too, we and the work that I do is really, we like to talk about it from like a values-based perspective. And there's a lot of values within the Jewish community about service and about sort of protecting your neighbor and taking care of your neighbor and repairing the world. And so I would say that from a perspective of like the partisan politics of it all, coming from a different policy background where I worked on housing, and it was extremely contentious to my dismay, the food space I do find more so than a lot of other spaces can at times be significantly less partisan, if only because there's a connection between sort of like urban hunger and rural agriculture and rural hunger as well. And I really try to like sort of make the point about like hunger and the reinvestment that like solving hunger puts into everybody's communities. It makes everybody healthier. It provides folks with better educational attainment. It makes more jobs. It also supports communities that are traditionally maybe potentially have different political ideologies than the folks that are experiencing hunger. And it's obviously there's like a bit of naivete in that, because we've just watched sort of what happened, and there are people in this country who will use partisan politics to take money for food away from people. And at the same time, I do really, in my heart of hearts, believe that like if we're solving hunger, we're meeting the needs of so many different communities and so many different problems that it really cuts across partisan lines in a way that a lot of other advocacy spaces maybe struggle to.
Thank you so much for speaking to that particular dynamic too, DJ. It is a delicate coalition, but a coalition nonetheless of those who are producing our food and those who are consuming our food. And I think that interfaith advocates have a very important role to play in those coalitions as well. And I want to, last couple of questions here before we open up for any questions. And just a reminder to folks that the Q&A is open if you have anything that you'd like to ask. I think that we would, of course, be remiss if we did not touch on the power of prayer during tough times, politically and otherwise. So, Aseel, I want to turn to you. How does prayer, in the context of advocacy, play a role in advancing policy?
So, our community has the Muslim American community. Has faced a lot of challenges within the last couple of years, whether it's from international foreign issues or even domestic in terms of Islamophobia. So we've sort of been through the ringer of it. And I think that if it wasn't for the power of prayer, and there's a specific surah in the Quran, a prayer in the Quran that says that with every hardship, there's a promised ease. And I think that if we kind of weren't able to hold on to that promise, I don't know if we would have been able to continue in the way that we have been, right? So that promise, and inna ma'al usri yusra, inna ma'al usri yusra, it's repeated several times, that every time that there is a lot of hardship, that there is a promised ease, and that keeps us going as a community.
Thank you so much. And is that something that you feel like you've been able to discuss with lawmakers, that it's translated into the policy space as well?
Yes, because we work in interfaith coalitions like this one, right? So when we are coming in, I think as Muslims alone, it's a little bit more challenging. But when we are going into policymaker offices and we are with our Christian and Jewish brothers and sisters, and we're saying, you understand that we are part and parcel of the Abrahamic faiths. I think a lot of our lawmakers don't even realize that, Muslims believe in Jesus, for example, and they're like, they're shocked. So when we go into these coalitions and they're like, and we have our, Christian brothers and Jewish brothers and sisters with us, yes, we can make those arguments in a way that's much easier than if we were coming on our own, to be honest. Yeah.
What about you, Charles? How can clergy and lay leaders of all faiths use that prayer and those shared religious morals when discussing anti-hunger policy with elected officials?
Yeah, so it can be something as easy as a short reflection at the start of a meeting. I've seen it set a tone of dignity, compassion, brotherhood, and sisterhood. I mean, leaders, they can connect their requests directly to those shared values that Aseel spoke to, right? Whether it's the vulnerability of a child, the worth of a child, the call to love our neighbor, the importance of protecting families who struggle to eat. Like, there are always those shared values. And so I think clergy leaders, lay leaders, they have I would say a shorter route to the hearts of our nation's leaders when you just focus on those shared values. I will also speak to the power of prayer. I believe that prayer works, and I've always noticed the greatest relationships that bloomed out of meetings that could be partisan and very, very tense to some degree. But I've noticed that when we close meetings with simple, hopeful prayer that invites those policymakers into a moral conversation instead of a partisan one, I think the heavens open up and we really get things done. So I think that shift from combativeness to that tone of dignity and compassion, it just makes the relationship with lawmakers more humane and productive.
Beautiful. Thank you, Charles. I want to just take a minute here to pause. If there are any audience questions that folks want to take the opportunity to drop in the chat, we do have a few minutes left. And while folks might be thinking about those and typing on that lovely last point that we just heard, I do want to drop a prayer that a rabbi affiliated with MAZON had developed, just as folks were realizing that they were not going to be receiving their November SNAP benefits at the start of the month, just so folks can see some of the language that that we've been employing and really relying on to lift our spirits and carry us as an interfaith community as well during this time. And drop that here. And I see there are no immediate questions here, so I want to open it back up to our panelists as well for any additional thoughts that that folks might want to share about, what is giving you hope, perhaps, what you're proud of that you've been able to accomplish in Interfaith Coalition. I know I can speak for myself in saying that the spaces that we all have shared over the last, especially month or two, have been absolutely bolstering to the spirit here. And thank you, Ruby. I see that you have a question in the chat. Many elected officials who are religious bring their views when voting or pushing for policy. What strategies can interfaith advocates use when working with these offices? And then also on the reverse, strategies for those officials that are not religious. Any kind of immediate thoughts on how we approach both those members that that talk a lot about their faith and how it leads them to their logical policy conclusions, and maybe those that don't?
I think I would go back to something that DJ said, that there are contentious issues out there around maybe housing, maybe how we utilize funding for education. There's like different viewpoints. I have found that food kind of unites people. I don't think there's a better example of that than what happened in Gaza. Like, people can have whatever views they want on Israel, Palestine, etc., but we can all agree that children should be fed. Right? Like, you can go into a contentious office that doesn't believe the same things you do, but you can say, look at this picture of this child who's experiencing famine, and do we not agree that that child should be fed? I think we can come to that common humanity when it comes to, whatever way we believe or religiously, when it comes to hunger around children, especially. I feel like that's an in to most offices, and I think that's also the case for those who are not religious, right? There's something about our moral compass that says we should be feeding people. One of our chatmates said, food is a human right, and it is, right? So I think starting from that place is usually an end to at least expanding conversations.
I absolutely agree, Aseel. You make some great points. I would just say this, I've probably been in every single office in Congress, and I've not had any member of their staffers say that they don't want to feed hungry children or hungry families, right? And so that, coupled with the fact that you took an oath of office to serve the American public, those are your baselines, right? And so you start with the fact that this is an issue, this is a human right, as flagged in the chat. And then, if they're non-religious, it's all about your service to the American public and your constituents, who you want to see eat.
I love holding members accountable when they use scripture, frequently, whether it's on the floor of the House or the Senate, whether it's in a press release. I think that faith advocates really have an opportunity to pry, to pose to those members, what does that really mean to you? What does that look like in your faith practice? I think there's an opportunity for discussion and extrapolation, and you can count on the folks who participate in our faith-based coalitions to have those conversations with those members, and then to do the work to kind of enlighten those who perhaps do not operate on any kind of faith-based motivation, that their work is purely secular in nature. I think that every representative in the Congress certainly serves a faith-based constituency, for some of them many different faith-based constituencies, and in order for them to represent them well, of course they have to understand where we're coming from with our advocacy as well. DJ, you might have the opportunity to have the final word if you would like it. No pressure.
Well, so the question in the queue. Okay, sorry. I thought it disappeared. It just moved. I think it's hard to sort of follow up on what all of you just said, because I think between the three of you, you really sort of covered the different ways that I would think about and talk about this topic. I do think just in general, there is, and with hunger, there is sort of like an inroads no matter what elected official you're talking to. Hunger is really like a universal issue across the entire country, and the food system is also, for what it's worth, like there's a very small minority of people who like work in agriculture, but the vastness of agriculture across the United States is huge. And so I do think assessing who you're talking to, what their district is, and how they maybe interact with food or hunger issues is the best way to go about it. And I really do think, having come from a lot of different policy worlds, I agree with everybody here that like I'm yet to really meet somebody who thinks that anybody should go without food. Whether or not their policy decisions or the way they vote on the budget actually says that, is a different thing. But I do really think that like food is such a vital resource to so many people, to so many traditions, to how people gather and how they have family traditions, and how, we serve a lot of different holiday traditions for different faith organizations across New York City. It really speaks to everybody. And yeah, I don't know.
Beautiful.
I don't know if that's the best last word.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I know we're about to come to an end of our session here. So I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists, who I know I'll be working with closely in the days to come.